William Paley wrote a work called Natural Theology and published it in 1802. And in that work, he lays out a teleological argument, the argument that focuses on the ends or purposes of things, and then makes an analogy to conclude that God exists. Paley begins with discussing this situation where suppose you're walking along this open area and you find a watch. Of course, in 1802, that would have been a pocket watch, a mechanical watch. And he says, imagine you find it and you look at it and you see it's very different from a rock, which, say, might have been there forever. But a watch is an intricately functioning, purposive, and complex thing. So if you were to open a pocket watch and you see all the cogs and the wheels and the springs working together, it's very intricate. It has a purpose of telling time. It's complex. It's not something somebody could just put together on their own without any training. And because of that, we can conclude that it is designed by an intelligent creator. We just look at the watch and we can see that it is designed. Then Paley compares that to the world or the universe. And he says the world is similar to a watch. It's intricately functioning, and he can talk about individual parts. So he talks about animals and plants, and on a larger scale with the planets and the sun and so on. There are purposive aspects, rain and sun alternating so things can grow and so on. Individual parts of a body have purposive aspects, and it's also very complex. The world is a very complex system. So we have this analogy. And by analogy, we can conclude that the world is designed by an intelligent creator. It has all those aspects of the watch that draw us to the conclusion that the watch is designed. And so we can conclude that the world is designed. Now, if we carry this out a little bit more, we could say, if the world is designed by an intelligent creator, then that creator is God, and we can conclude that the world is designed by God. Now, if we want to be really particular here, we carry it out one more step. Of course, if the world is designed by God, then that means that God exists. So this is an argument for the existence of God. The conclusion is that God exists. It's a simple argument in one sense. It's the kind of intuitive argument that's easy to explain to people. In fact, Paley himself did not really explain it that well, but he assumed that people would get the drift of the argument. When you make this analogy, it seems to make sense. A lot of people think this is a clear-cut argument. But Paley's concerned about whether or not it works. Now, it's an argument by analogy, or at least the main portion that's doing the work is an argument by analogy. So we should think a little bit about how you assess an argument by analogy. And there are two considerations. First question that you need to ask, are the similarities of the things being compared relevant to the issue at hand? So when you're comparing two things and drawing an analogy, you have to ask, are you comparing the right things? So for example, if you were going to talk about the efficiency and speed of a computer, you shouldn't be, and then you're talking about two computers, right? You shouldn't be comparing what color the tower is and what kind of monitor it's hooked up to and what kind of keyboard it has if you're thinking about speed and efficiency, right? You need to talk about the processor and how much RAM it has and so on. So you need to talk about the relevant things when you're doing an argument by analogy. And then also, of course, are there sufficient similarities to draw the conclusion? Once you start focusing on the right kinds of similarity, are there enough of them? Are there sufficient number of them to draw the conclusion? So when we're assessing Paley's argument, we want to ask these two questions, and Paley does this himself, and he imagines some criticisms that could be raised. And so we have potential objections and then responses by Paley. And this is actually the bulk of the portion of the teleological argument in Paley's writings are considering these objections. So one objection, well, wait a minute, these two things are too different because we've seen watches made, but we've never seen anything like the world made. So the analogy doesn't work. We can't use this kind of analogy. We're familiar with how watches are made, completely unfamiliar with how worlds are made. So there's no way you can compare the two. They're too different. Now, Paley responds to this. Of course, he's the one that is considering the objection. And he said, well, wait a minute. Even if we had never seen a watch made, and who has, right? So you could still draw the conclusion, even if we had no idea how to make a watch, we could still conclude that the watch was designed by looking at it. Even if we didn't even know what a watch was, had never seen one before, we could still draw the conclusion that it was designed. And he says, so it is with the world. We don't have to see it made. So the dissimilarity there is irrelevant to our conclusion. Paley goes on and considers several other objections. Here's a second one. The world is full of imperfections, so it doesn't seem to be designed. Now, we could branch off into the problem of evil here, but that's not really the issue at hand. We are just talking about imperfections, things that don't seem to work well. So there are places that get too much rain, places that don't get enough rain. Sometimes babies are born blind. We have these problems with the way the world works. It's imperfect. And so it doesn't seem to be designed because of that. Now, Paley's response is, well, wait a minute. If a watch had imperfections, that would not show it wasn't designed. If you found the watch in the open area, you looked at it, you saw all of its features, you were able to open up and see the springs and cogs and wheels, how they all fit together. Well, do you conclude that it isn't designed because you find out that it loses a minute every hour? It's imperfect, it doesn't work perfectly? Of course not. You still would conclude it's designed, and he says, so it is with the world. Obviously, a lot more to discuss here, but that's his response, right? Imperfections alone don't show you that it wasn't designed. Third objection. Some aspects of the world don't seem to fit into a coherent design. We don't understand why some things are here and why some things happen as they do. So as a friend of mine once said, I don't understand why God made mosquitoes. Obviously, she believed in God, but she didn't understand why mosquitoes were there. Now, when I suggested that they were there to feed the bats, the bats needed something to eat and they eat mosquitoes, that didn't help very much because she said, why do we need bats? She didn't like bats either. Well, so it goes. There are things that it doesn't seem coherent that they're here. Why couldn't we just leave those things out? Well, a response to this concern is, well, so what if we found some aspects of a watch that we didn't seem to fit into a coherent design? We couldn't see how they functioned. So you open it up and you see how things are interconnected and you see a lot of what's going on and how it all works, but maybe there's a part that doesn't make sense to you, right? Does that mean that the watch wasn't designed? Of course not. We wouldn't conclude that the watch as a whole was not designed if we find that, and we should not throw out the idea that the world is designed for the same reason. Another objection here is that the world had to be some way, and this is just the way it happens to be. There's no reason to think it was designed. Things had to be some way. It's just the way it is. Now, this objection in other forms of arguments is still around today in the contemporary design argument. So it is significant to consider. Now, Paley's response, though, is, well, wait a minute. Would you, if you found the watch in the open field, would you just look at it and say, oh, glass, silicon, well, it's an element, it has to exist somewhere. Oh, there's some iron. it has to be somewhere or another. Oh, copper. Well, you know, it's copper. It's got to be some form or shape or something. It just happened to be that way. Now, of course, you would never say that of the watch. So Paley asked, why would you think that's the case with the world? A fifth objection is that there's simply an impersonal principle of order that the world follows. We don't see it, we don't know it. There's no intentional design. There's no intelligent being behind the design. There's this force that gives order to things. Maybe that's what's going on, and it just makes us think that the world is designed. Now, Paley's response is, well, wait a minute, come on. Would you say that of the watch? Would you say there are just these impersonal forces that cause silicon to put together to have this circular piece of glass, and just these impersonal forces that causes the copper and the iron and the other materials to take the shapes they do and then happen to fit together? He says, of course not. You would never say that of the watch, that there's these impersonal principles that are just causing it to be that way. So why would you think that's the case with the world? Now here, not to chase it out, but certainly after 1859 and Darwin's publishing of The Origin of the Species, there has since been discussion of an impersonal principle of order, the principle of evolution. And so that would be relevant to the argument. Of course, Paley had no way of knowing about that, having written well before Darwin. And again, we'll leave that there. Here's the objection and response that Paley has. We have a couple more to cover. Objection 6. Well, there's no proof here. There's just a natural tendency on our part to think that there's design. Your argument isn't a valid deductive argument. It's relying on an analogy, which is inductive reasoning. So there's no proof. So that doesn't mean there's actually design because of the form of argumentation. Now, this is actually something that Hume raises, and when we consider Hume's response to the teleological argument, we'll pursue this more closely with more details. But Paley says, look, it may not be a proof. It may not be a proof of the kind you would find in geometry. In other words, you don't have a valid deductive argument because you're using analogy, but hey, there's reason enough to draw a conclusion. It's an inductive argument. We reason by induction all the time. That's what we have here. It's not really that big of a problem. And finally, the seventh objection, we don't know enough about the world to draw the conclusion that it's designed. We keep learning more and more about the details of the world. So we think we know it all now, but of course, that's what people thought 200 years ago. And we see how little they actually knew. And 200 years from now, they'll probably think the same of us. So we just don't know enough to draw a conclusion. And of course, Paley has this response that, well, wait a minute, would you really say that of the watch? We don't know enough about the watch to draw the conclusion. We don't know where the copper came from, maybe, or why the spring has that particular force, and so on. So we would never say that of the watch just because we don't know all there is to know about the watch. So why think that's the case with the world, that we can't draw the conclusion it's designed just because we don't know everything about the world? Paley goes on to say, as a matter of fact, we see more and more design the more closely we examine the world, and so it actually bolsters his position.